Grandpa Simpson might possibly be the most interesting man in Springfield. The guy has basically done it all. However, Grandpa is also the most unreliable narrator in Springfield, and everything he says must be taken with a huge grain of salt. And the Simpsons timeline? Well, it's pretty unreliable too. So for today's Simpsons Mysteries, we're going to dive into the Grandpa backstory, find out what is fact, what is fiction, and what is a little from column A, a little from column B. The history of Abraham Simpson can be broken into 5 distinct eras. 1. His early years. 2. World War II. 3. Life in the 1950s. 4. His marriage to Mona. And 5. His life as a single father. For the purposes of this study, we're going to tackle one era at a time. I'm going to give a rundown of everything that happened, or Grandpa says happened. I'm going to initially treat everything as true. And then at the end, we'll sort through the inconsistencies. Now, since we're talking about the timeline, there are the usual caveats. The writers obviously didn't plan out anything with Grandpa's backstory. They just kinda added on to stuff as they went along. This is more or less a study of the big picture, to see how all the random details line up with each other. So with that being said, Grandpa's full name is Abraham Simpson II, as he was named after his grandfather who was born and lived in Canada. His ancestors escaped the United States via the Underground Railroad. Abraham II was born in the quote-unquote old country and immigrated to the United States as a young boy. Then they filled the Statue of Liberty with garbage. He had several run-ins with Grover Cleveland, who spanked him on 2 non-consecutive occasions. He also served in World War I as a very young boy. Grandpa's father was a professional child beater, giving demonstrations for visiting professors. At some point, Grandpa was voted the handsomest boy in Albany, New York. His real childhood passion was whistling, and he was featured on a famous radio show. He tried a stunt called the Triple Windy, and blew out all the ligaments in his lips. As he grew older, he had to pay other guys to kiss his girlfriend for him, which they were happy to oblige. In 1928, he and C.W. McAllister attempted to climb to the peak of the Murder Horn. However, Grandpa stole McAllister's oxygen and tried to eat his left arm. The 1930s consisted of a variety of odd jobs for Grandpa. He was a professional grifter during the Great Depression. In 1936, he participated in the Berlin Summer Olympics in the javelin event, very nearly killing Hitler by complete accident. Sometime later, in 1936 or 1937, he worked as a shoeshine boy at the train station. He gave Clark Gable a copy of Gone with the Wind and suggested he should do a film about it. In 1938, Grandpa worked in the movie industry himself, performing in The Wizard of Oz. In 1942, he tried to avoid military service by playing in a women's baseball league, until he was eventually found out. End of part 1. The biggest mystery here is trying to figure out Grandpa's exact birth year. The Grover Cleveland incident puts him around 1880, whereas World War I suggests he was born around 1908 or so. Honestly, given how crazy both events are, I'm going to chalk both of these up to senility. I think it's far more likely that Grandpa was born around 1920, as he would have been a teen to young adult hustling in the 1930s, around 25 years old for World War II, and then he'd be in his 30s for the 1950s. Grandpa describes the Murder Horn events happening in 1928, but it's possible this happened later. I also think Grandpa was born in Canada, and that was the old country he referred to. It's possible that his father moved to Ireland or wherever in the generations in between. I just think when you have a later episode confirming the Simpsons' ancestors outside the US, you should take it as a hint. Everything else in his early years, except for maybe the Clark Gable thing, we can reliably assume is true. We have his grifting book, the Murder Horn documentation, his whistling skills. Even his father being a disciplinarian explains the strangling. The early Grandpa years are basically apocrypha at this point. I think we have a vague outline of what he did prior to World War II, but the specific details are exaggerated. Speaking of World War II, Grampa first enlisted in the US Navy. He was watch commander at Pearl Harbor in 1941, right before the attack. Then he served on the USS World War I until it was destroyed, and Grampa survived by learning how to ride sharks. In 1943, he was on PT Boat 109 with German spy John F. Kennedy. He served as a pilot in the Navy with Mr. Burns, and the two of them got stranded on an island together. They shot down Santa, had a battle over his sleigh and reindeer, and eventually Santa left them stranded. In 1944, he joined the Army and was stationed in the UK. This included a stay in Ireland, where he frequented O'Flanagan's pub. In June of 1944, he met a woman named Edwina, and spent the night together before he shipped out. Here's where he fathered his first child, Abby, the first of Homer's half-siblings. Grampa was sergeant of the Flying Hellfish, the fightingest squad in the fightingest company in the 3rd Fightingest Battalion in the Army. He was at the Battle of the Bulge and attempted to assassinate Hitler. Grampa didn't exactly have the most flawless Army career, though. At some point, he was separated from his platoon and briefly worked as a cabaret singer in Germany. In the closing days of the war, the Flying Hellfish were investigating an abandoned castle in Germany, and, under the suggestion of Private Burns, conspired to steal several priceless paintings, forming a tontine to determine ownership. End of part 2. Okay, so there are a lot of questions here about Grampa's Army and Navy service, especially his experience in the Navy. The Army stuff is pretty well documented via Raging Abe Simpson episode and other random tidbits. Okay, the cabaret thing probably didn't happen, even Bart calls it out in the episode, but the other Army stuff certainly did. Whereas his Navy career is full of shark riding and run-ins with Santa and JFK, without much evidence to support any of it. The only confirmation comes from Santa himself. So we're stuck with the conundrum of whether Season 17's Simpsons Christmas Stories is canon and Santa's a real person in the world of the Springfield. I'm inclined to say that this was a big fever dream. Now, it is definitely possible for someone to serve in multiple branches of the military, and there were soldiers who participated in both the Pacific and European theaters. I think Grampa was indeed in the Navy first. Maybe he left when things started heating up after Pearl Harbor. But his specific events, I don't really buy. Sorry, Grampa. Maybe they need another Raging Abe Simpson episode confirming what a Navy badass he was. In 1947, Grampa was offered $50 and a royalty to be the model for a toy company's new Army Man plastic figures. Grampa got along really well with the photographer, Philip Heflin, eventually telling him, "You're my kind of man, if you know what I mean." Philip then kissed him, causing Grampa to run away in a fit of gay panic. He never signed the royalties contract, thereby missing out on millions of dollars. Later that same year, Grampa met Chester J. Lampwick, who he offered some corn muffins to paint his chicken coop. Unfortunately, the corn muffins were lousy. In the 1950s, Grampa entered the world of professional wrestling as the infamous heel Glamorous Godfrey. His unapologetic cheating and unparalleled vanity made him someone the audience loved to hate. Mr. Burns was Glamorous Godfrey's biggest fan, collecting all of his memorabilia. However, Grampa couldn't deal with being hated and hung up his wrestling boots. At some point, Grampa was on a crooked quiz show and won a house. He later ratted out the producers during the congressional hearings. At some point, he was also a union buster, and he joined the Elks, the Stonecutters, Masons, Communists, and was elected the president of the Gay and Lesbian Alliance. Grampa re-enlisted in the military in the 1950s, this time joining the Air Force. At a nearby bar, he met Mona Simpson, who was working as a cocktail waitress. While he was courting her, he visited a carnival to check out the local skirts. Grampa paid a carnival worker to dunk the clown, and his prize was fathering another child. Back at the base, he stole an experimental aircraft to impress Mona or something. He broke both the sound barrier and the plane itself. Jack Kerouac gave him a ride home, and Abe mailed in his rambling and incoherent first draft to the publisher. When returning to the bar, he proposed to Mona, who agreed to marry him. End of part 3. The Simpson family mentions that Grampa served in every branch of the military, so at some point he was in the Marines and Coast Guard too. Your guess is as good as mine exactly when. But overall, the continuity is surprisingly straightforward for this part of his life, He tried various things to make money, joined the Air Force, and met Mona. Everything is pretty well documented. I really like the irony of Mr. Burns inadvertently becoming Grandpa's #1 fan, given their prior history together. It's really only the Air Force stuff we have to take Grandpa's word for. Even if you don't believe a couple details, I think the general story about meeting Mona is credible. It does link up to Grandpa's trip to the carnival in an interesting way though, which, as we're about to find out, might be the big turning point in the Grandpa Simpson story. Abe and Mona's engagement was a happy one. They used to go dancing, and Abe even got a tattoo of her name over his heart. He found out he fathered a child after visiting the carnival again, and 1 year later, he and Mona got married. However, unlike their engagement, their early marriage was immediately dysfunctional. We know 3 things happened around this time. First, Abe told Mona about Herb at some point. Second, Mona cheated on him. And third, Grandpa started making his tonic around this time. When Homer was born, Mona insisted that he never tells him about Herb, so that he will grow up to respect his father. After taking Homer home from the hospital, Abe and Mona lived on a farm. They got a dog named Bongo, who was devoted to Homer and would never leave his side. Grandpa was not exactly supportive of young Homer, but he did dress up like Santa to surprise him for Christmas, and he would jingle his keys to amuse his son. Homer rewarded him by driving away in his car and spooking the cows into producing sour milk. The bank foreclosed on the farm, and by 1967, they moved to a house in Springfield. Their marriage continued to be an unhappy one. Mona had wanted to take some classes at the local community college, but Abe refused, and they would fight every year during the 4th of July fireworks. Abe was generally dismissive and aloof as a husband, being more interested in watching Super Bowl III. In the summer of 1969, he was dragged to Woodstock and fought with Mona over their parenting styles. They eventually started going to weekly marriage counseling sessions. Grandpa worked at a model plane factory and spent his free time constructing model planes from World War II. Homer would do typical clumsy kid stuff and would be sent upstairs to do some baking with Mona. Abe and Homer did have some good times together though. They went on a fishing trip together, and although little Homer mentions he hears his parents fighting, Grandpa reassured him, telling him not to worry about them. Then Homer does more clumsy kid stuff. 1 week later, Mona had her run-in with Mr. Burns and went into hiding. Due to their fishing trip, she left Homer knowing that he was in good hands with his father. However, Grandpa understandably felt hurt by Mona leaving him to raise Homer alone. That night, he got drunk, took Homer's treasured recipe box, and bitterly threw it off a cliff, along with Mona's other possessions. End of part 4. Hear me out for a second, but I think the birth of Herb Powell might have created a giant snowball effect on the continuity. The carnival incident happened before Mona and Abe were together proper, when he was still courting her. Mona got with the lifeguard around the time Homer was conceived, and Grandpa felt the need to spice up his marriage around this time. I think it's pretty inconsistent for Mona to be so disappointed Abe had a child out of wedlock when she herself had cheated on her marriage at this point. Now, we don't have the specific details of the relationship. It's not clear if there's a direct cause and effect here. It's just evident that a schism between these two formed quickly, and they let it grow and fester. Maybe Herb was the inciting incident. Grandpa checked out emotionally, Mona fell in with the hippies. Would Mona have taken these risks if Abe were more supportive of her? Maybe, but it wouldn't be fair to say that it's Grandpa's fault he had to raise Homer alone. I mean, Mr. Burns is genuinely a terrible person, and eventually someone is going to play the hero and try to stop him. But when that person falls in battle, somebody back home gets stuck to pick up the pieces. Unfortunately, that was Grandpa. As we're about to see, he was thrust into a difficult situation he clearly wasn't prepared for. We get 2 different versions of what Grandpa said to Homer about Mona's disappearance. According to Mother Simpson, Grandpa said Mona died when he was at the movies. The reasoning being that he didn't want Homer to know his mother was a wanted criminal. However, in season 29, Grandpa lied to Homer about the recipe box saying Mona took it with her. After Mona left, Grampa worked as a busboy at Spiro's, writing songs and playing the piano in his spare time. This drew the attention of the restaurant singer Rita LaFleur. The two bonded over music, fell in love, and eventually got married. After another clumsy kid accident on their wedding day, Homer ended up in the hospital. Rita found out that she just got her big break, booking a year-long music tour through Europe. Grampa considered going, but decided it would be healthier for Homer to stay in Springfield. After a very tearful farewell, Grampa took Homer to the airport bar to forget their troubles. After Rita left, it was just Grandpa, Homer, and their dog Bongo. Remember him? Grandpa was working at a smokestack factory, and Bongo and Homer were best buddies. Mr. Burns was preparing to open Springfield Nuclear Power Plant, and after a struggle during a PR event, Bongo bit him. To prevent Mr. Burns from killing Bongo, Grandpa took him away to live on a farm in the country. Grandpa met up with Mr. Burns afterwards and made a deal with him to take care of his hounds for a full year. And as one final parting shot, Mr. Burns forced Grandpa to only wear slippers and a bolo tie for the rest of his years. Unfortunately, the damage was permanently done to Grandpa and Homer's relationship. Homer resented his father for getting rid of Bongo, not knowing about the situation with Mr. Burns. And according to Grandpa, no amount of ignoring the problem could fix it. After this point, we get small glimpses of Homer and Grandpa's tenuous relationship. Homer had an amazing voice as a child, potentially making Grandpa a millionaire, but puberty ruined those plans. In high school, Homer joined the gymnastics team, but Grandpa was not supportive of him, sabotaging Homer's routine, then telling him that's what he gets for having faith in him. When Homer was pursuing Marge, he goes to Grandpa for advice, but Grandpa criticizes him for aiming too high. Then, after the timeline floats forward, like 10 years, Homer and Marge are dating post-high school in the 1990s. Grandpa owns a laser tag business, and Homer very begrudgingly has to get a job with him. After Marge gets pregnant, though, Grandpa celebrates, telling Homer he has to marry her because he's never going to do any better. But luckily, this bit of history has a happy ending. As a wedding gift, Grandpa gives Homer every dime he has saved. And later, he sells his house to pay for Homer and Marge's down payment on 742 Evergreen Terrace. And that brings us to present day. So what have we learned from all of this? Well, first of all, in terms of Grandpa's entire history, there aren't that many direct contradictions and retcons. I'm honestly kind of surprised. The timeline is pretty flexible, where his Navy, Army, and Air Force service happen in different time periods. You could argue that the 1950s stuff is the timeline floating, and therefore retcons the World War II service out of existence, but even the super modern episodes reference that time period. The most explicit contradiction in the timeline is the explanation he gives to Homer about Mona. It's possible that both versions are true, that it was a combined story about Mona leaving Homer when he was at the movies, taking the recipes, and dying. It seems weird to completely retcon Season 7, switching over to abandonment issues, so maybe there's enough wiggle room to use both. Next, we got to talk about Mr. Burns, the true villain of the Simpson family history. Honestly, the relationship between Homer, Grandpa, and Mr. Burns is really dark the more you look into it. It starts with Mr. Burns getting carried by Grandpa through the war. Then he unknowingly becomes Grandpa's biggest fan. Mr. Burns' vindictive power and wealth scares Mona into leaving her family. Mr. Burns' vindictiveness towards Bongo fractures the relationship between Grandpa and Homer. And Homer, whose life has been ruined in many ways by Mr. Burns, grows up to work for him. Honestly, I kind of wish it were Homer who shot Mr. Burns, because no one in the world deserves to do it more than him. Finally, I think the biggest lingering question is how good or bad of a father Grandpa was to Homer. I think it's too simplistic to say that Grandpa was only a bad, verbally abusive father and deserved to be put in a home. It is way more complicated than that. The episodes with Bongo and Rita LaFleur demonstrate that after Mona left, he stopped being the stereotype of the emotionally distant 1960s dad. Grandpa actually stepped up in Mona's absence, really did try his best for his son. He very easily could have taken Homer on the road to Europe, but he chose to stay because he worried about him. Grampa sacrificed a lot of personal happiness for his son. When Rita leaves and Homer asks if he's okay, Grampa replies, "Well, of course I'm okay. I'm with you." Grandpa's biggest failing is that he doesn't handle adversity that well when it comes to relationships. When a relationship starts going downhill, he just doesn't seem to know how to fix it. He either ignores the problem or actively feeds into it. Not many stories of forgiveness and reconciliation in Grandpa's past. It's heartbreaking seeing the dad who sacrificed to save his son's dog transform into the antagonistic gymnastics dad. Grampa could have been a better, more consistent father to Homer. The extremely challenging task of being a single father, combined with Abe's stubbornness and laziness, was a bad situation for both of them. But at the very least, he's got one thing going for him, that when Mona left, Abe chose to stay. I wish things shook out better for the two of them. Thanks for taking this trip with me through the Grandpa Simpson timeline. Since his story is told so haphazardly through so many random episodes, it's nice to see how everything fits together. The writers clearly couldn't make up their mind how sympathetically or heroically they wanted to portray him. Even his birth year is kind of a mystery. At least they didn't make too much of a mess with his timeline. With his extensive military history, his odd jobs, and Forrest Gump-esque brushes with fame, Grandpa Simpson legitimately has claim to being the most interesting man in Springfield. If only he could get someone to listen to him.